The morning of Monday, July 14, 2008. Some workers who were working on a section of the highway that connects Petare with Guarenas, east of Caracas, in Venezuela, came across something on the side of the road, in a vacant lot. It was the body of a young woman, with her face so damaged that it was impossible to tell who she was at first glance. She didn't have any documents on her, and no one in the area could recognize her, so for the first few hours, she remained unidentified to the authorities. Especially in a country where this kind of discovery was nothing unusual. Another nameless death on the side of a highway. But this girl was no unknown. She was Roxana Vargas, a 19-year-old young woman who had been reported missing 2 days earlier. She had done something that no victim usually has the chance to do, because before she died, she had given her mother the details about the person who, according to Roxana, had warned her that he was going to kill her. She had told her mother that if anything happened to her, it had to have been him. The problem was that when that mother went to the police to point out the person responsible, what she had to offer was almost impossible to believe, because the man she was accusing had nothing to do with the image anyone might have of a murderer. He was one of the most respected people in the country, and for more than 30 years behind a closed door, he had been doing something that almost no one wanted or could imagine. Roxana was the only one who, almost unintentionally, left the evidence that would bring everything down, fortunately. Before continuing with this story, since we're talking about Venezuela, I want to send my condolences and support to the Venezuelan people. Venezuela. And this isn't to say it's more important, that's not why I'm mentioning this, but Venezuela is one of the countries that has supported me from the very beginning. I know that what I'm mentioning now is coming quite late. I wanted to say that we record the videos in advance, so I didn't get the message out in time. But really, we're all with Venezuela in these terrible times. I'm in South Florida, and in every state in the United States, in practically every city, there are groups to support Venezuela. I want to leave the contact information of one of the guys in charge of this. If you are in Florida, in the Miami area, up to Boca Raton, and even a little further, get in touch with Camilo Segura. He's a friend of mine, and he's trustworthy because he's helping out here. His Instagram is acasemo44, I'll put it on the screen, and you can see how to help there. And if you can, leave them in the comments. Also the contacts of people in other cities, states, and even countries who are also helping out. Because the whole country needs us. When the forensic investigators arrived at the vacant lot in Parque Caiza, they found the body of a young woman. And she was wearing a white blouse with pink flowers, and this blouse was pulled up, as well as a black skirt that was also pulled up, exposing her underwear. The young woman had visible signs of violence, mainly concentrated on her face and head. She had been beaten severely and left lying there in an open field. At the edge of the highway, as if someone was just getting rid of something, that's all. In those first hours, the authorities considered several hypotheses, and all of them made sense in Caracas at that time. He could have been the victim of an everyday crime that happened daily in the city and left people dead every weekend. It could also have been an express kidnapping that ended badly, another widespread type of crime. At that time, there was even the possibility that it was something political, because it would soon be known that the young woman was interning at a television channel. It was identified as being opposed to the current government. There were 4 or 5 different paths, all valid, honestly, and none of them yet pointed to where they really needed to look. The identification took only a few days. They discovered that the body belonged to Roxana Vargas Quintana, but a 19-year-old communications student who had been reported missing on July 12, 2 days before she was found in that vacant lot. The autopsy determined that the cause of death was a traumatic brain injury. She had, according to the forensic analysis, at least 7 fractures in her skull, and a very important detail. All of them had been inflicted while she was still alive, right? And there was one more detail, one that at that moment didn't fit with the idea of a street robbery or a random kidnapping. When Roxana's body was carefully examined, it was noticed that one of her earrings was missing while the other was still on. And that small object, which seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what they were facing, would end up being one of the pieces that tied the whole case together. Although it would still take weeks of investigation before that earring could speak. The first thing the investigators did, as in any disappearance case, was to reconstruct Roxana's last hours, because they wanted to know who she had been with, where she had gone, and who had seen her last. And there, almost immediately, a voice emerged, someone the police weren't expecting, but who would tie all the loose ends together, because this person already had the answer. And it was the voice of this woman's mother, the victim's mother. Before going into more details about the case, we need to talk about who Roxana was. Roxana was born and raised in Valle de la Pascua, a town in the state of Guárico, in the central plains of Venezuela. She lived there with her 2 parents and her sister named Mariana. As a child, she was a cheerful and disciplined girl. Her family and friends described her as a very outgoing, charismatic and affectionate person, also a bit stubborn and very close to her mom, because she told her everything. Roxana had a dream, and she pursued this dream with a determination that we can say was admirable. She wanted to study communications in Caracas, and she also wanted to work in television. And she went after that goal. She got a scholarship, moved alone to the capital, enrolled at the Santa Rosa Catholic University, and eventually managed to get an internship at RCTV, where she worked as a production assistant, no less than on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, one of the most watched shows in the country at that time. On July 12th, Roxana was last seen alive. She had said goodbye to her university classmates, telling them she was going to see her therapist. And that afternoon, Ana Teresa Quintero, Roxana's mother, had spoken with her daughter around 6 p.m. and she told her that her psychiatrist had called her and wanted to see her. Her mother told her not to go because it was already getting dark, but Roxana didn't listen, so she called her again at 7 p.m. And at that moment, her mother said she sensed she was very tense. That was the last communication she had with her daughter. That night, her family lost all contact with her, and we're talking about her not answering calls or messages either. And she hadn't returned to her apartment, so her mother obviously started to get worried. And that's how she filed the missing person report, right from the very beginning. Even before the body was found, Ana Teresa had given only one version, always the same, that her daughter was disappeared by her psychiatrist. She said it with such certainty. It came from something that Roxana herself had told her shortly before. A week before she died, the young woman had warned her mother that she felt threatened by that man. And for that very reason, she gave her mother the psychiatrist's phone numbers. And also a very specific instruction that if anything happened to her, it was most likely him who was responsible. Just imagine. And this is without a doubt one of the most chilling things about the case. Because remember, at that time, Roxana was only 19 years old. And days before she died, she not only sensed what was coming, but she also took action. Without knowing it, she left what amounted to her own advance accusation. So when the body was found, the family had no doubt about who to accuse. I think this also teaches something very important. If you have doubts, let acquaintances and friends know. Share your location with whoever you want. Trust them. The problem in this case, with Roxana's case, was that she was on the other side of that equation, because the man they were accusing was not just anyone. And accusing him in Venezuela in 2008 and without absolutely solid evidence was practically like not accusing anyone at all. It was the word of a family from some remote town against one of the country's best-known men. We could say it was almost a lost cause from the start, because once you hear who this man was, this story becomes truly hard to believe. I think this case will give you goosebumps if you haven't heard about it yet. Yeah. His name was Edmundo Chirinos, and for a large part of the country, he was more or less the father of Venezuelan psychiatry. His resume was immense. He had pursued 2 degree programs at the same time. We're talking about medicine and psychology. And he had also trained abroad, at universities in England and also in France. At least, that's what was repeated over and over in his public presentations. In Venezuela, he had taught several courses, served as Dean of the School of Psychology, and had presided over the Venezuelan Society of Psychiatry. He eventually became the rector of the Central University of Venezuela, the most important and prestigious educational institution in the country. And if all that wasn't enough, he had also entered politics, as he was a member of the Constituent Assembly of 1999. The one that drafted the current constitution. And years before, he had even run as a candidate for the presidency of the Republic. But his most important, impressive credential wasn't in any of those positions, but rather in his list of patients. Over the years, 3 presidents of Venezuela had sat on his couch. Jaime Lucinchi, Rafael Caldera, and the very famous Hugo Chavez. He was literally the psychiatrist of the most powerful men in the country, the one who treated whoever was in power. So we're talking about a doctor, not just any doctor, with direct access to the highest circles of power, with academic prestige built over decades, with a regular presence in the media, considered by colleagues and also by the public as an undisputed authority in his field. Naturally, when a man like that says something, everyone ends up believing him. That's the truth. And therefore, when a man like that denies something, the weight of doubt doesn't fall on him. It falls on the person who is accusing him. And this is how power and prestige work. And Edmundo knew it better than anyone because he had used it to his advantage all his life. There was something else on top of that which made him especially hard to go after, and that will be key later on. And that's because Edmundo knew how to manage his own public image. He was comfortable in front of the cameras. He knew what to say, also how to say it, and he knew how to present himself to the country as an older gentleman, cultured, calm, and completely above any suspicion. Of the 2 main characters in this story, he was the only one with the real ability to control what people thought, to control the narrative. While Roxana was just an unknown student, and that huge difference in power between the 2 would shape everything that happened next in this story. What almost no one knew at that time, what was barely whispered in some circles without anyone being able to prove it, was what that man had been doing for more than 3 decades behind the door of his office. And at what point in the story did the 2 of them become intertwined? Well, precisely because of that extensive resume and reputation the doctor had, Roxana came to Edmundo Chirinos' office through her mother, who had also been his patient years before, for a case of postpartum depression. For the family, going to Chirinos was the same as going to the best, with someone absolutely trustworthy, backed by a career that seemed impeccable. And there's one of the keys to how all of this worked. Trust wasn't earned by the man himself, but was lent to him by his position, his title, his fame, the people he surrounded himself with, and who his clients were. Most importantly, no one suspected the president's psychiatrist. Roxana had been going through difficulties related to her mental health for some time. During her adolescence, she began to feel, in her own words, ugly, fat, and alone. Then eating disorders appeared, anorexia and bulimia. She also had depression, and with all that, something even darker came along. She began to cut herself, hiding the wounds under her clothes. She also started pouring everything she felt into a personal diary, which she later transferred to a blog on the internet. Since her emotional deterioration didn't stop, her mother decided to take her to see Dr. Chirinos starting in 2007, obviously to see the best, or so it seemed. The psychiatrist diagnosed her with schizophrenia, prescribed her medication, and recommended a treatment that he himself had made his trademark over the years, the so-called sleep cures. And it's worth explaining what that is, because it's actually the heart of the method this gentleman used. In theory, a sleep cure is a real psychiatric procedure in which the patient is sedated to induce a deep and prolonged sleep, with the idea that this forced rest will have a therapeutic effect. It's a treatment that actually exists, and at one time it was used to some extent. The problem with this practice is what this man could do with all of this. Because according to everything that was later proven in his office, the sleep cure wasn't a treatment, but rather a mechanism of abuse. The pattern reconstructed from dozens of testimonies and from the very evidence that was later found was frighteningly meticulous. First, he analyzed the patient, studied her, identified her vulnerability. After this, he sedated her under the pretext of the sleep cure. He left her asleep and defenseless on the office couch and abused her. He abused the women while they couldn't defend themselves because they were sedated. They couldn't resist. They also couldn't clearly remember what had happened afterward. What had happened. And as a final layer of horror, we have to mention the photographs. They were unconscious women, with their clothes half removed, photographed by their own doctor at the moment when they were most defenseless. And this wasn't something that Chirinos did only to Roxana. It was, according to everything that came to light, a pattern that continued for more than 30 years. We're talking about decades. An entire generation of women ended up on that couch. And let's remember, he was a powerful man. He was a man recommended by presidents. So therefore he had many clients. Yes, people trusted him. And the thing is, there's a huge gap between what was suspected and what can be proven. And during all those years, no one could prove anything. If you put yourself in those women's shoes, you can understand, because they would leave that office confused with memory lapses from the sedation, also ashamed and without clear memories. And in front of them was an untouchable man, an eminent figure, and the president's psychiatrist. And it must be mentioned, it must be said, that this strategy, this thing about them being sedated, and that's because if any of them tried to report or say something, for this doctor, it was easy to say, she was sedated, she was completely asleep, it was a dream, or it was her imagination. And with the power this man had, obviously people ended up believing him. Who were they going to report to, and who would believe them? To a patient who, on top of that, he himself had labeled with a psychiatric diagnosis rather than the word of such an important figure. Chirinos' own prestige worked as his best alibi. His fame also protected him. And he knew this perfectly well. Roxana ended up being different, and it was for a single reason he hadn't seen coming. No. Shallow. While all this was happening in her life, Roxana kept writing, just as she had throughout her adolescence and into adulthood. She poured her entire life into a blog and a personal diary, with that slightly naive, almost unfiltered frankness with which the young people of her generation, the first to grow up with the internet, shared absolutely everything online. But in her particular case, these texts carried a weight that she herself perhaps couldn't digest, couldn't grasp, because, without meaning to, she was leaving written evidence with dates and details. The direct account of what was happening to her. On those pages, she described in her own words and amid her own confusion. What was that first meeting or sleep therapy session she had with the psychiatrist like? She said that she was very afraid that day, that he treated her well, told her she was beautiful and many other things, and that he kissed her in a way she would never forget. She wrote that afterwards they kept talking, that he told her it would happen again, but without any commitment, because he was much older than her. She made it clear that, without meaning to, she was starting to feel affection for the doctor and that she knew it was wrong. Because to him, she was nothing more than an object, and she even wrote that her first intimate encounter in life had been with him, with her psychiatrist. This section was the testimony of a 19-year-old girl describing what seemed to be some kind of romantic relationship with her psychiatrist. But it was a completely unequal power relationship between a man over 70 years old who was her treating doctor, a figure of authority. And we've already mentioned this in many videos, that difference in power, age, and professional role. This was the man who was supposed to cure her, and she was a vulnerable patient of only 19 years old. And he could have taken advantage of the mental fragility she was experiencing at that time. Later, it was determined that Roxana actually suffered from borderline personality disorder, also known simply as borderline. And that Chirino took advantage of that condition, of that fragility, to dominate her in an interview, a disorder. Her sister? She said that after leaving one of her last sleep therapy sessions, Roxana came out sedated and very quiet. Later, she told her mother that the doctor had abused her, that she couldn't scream, defend herself, or ask for help because she was drugged and could barely move. They sought advice to see what they could do, and they recommended not to report it to the police because she would be treated very badly, and that they wouldn't believe her because she was under psychiatric treatment, which is what I just said. And could Dr. Chirino later claim that it was just the patient's imagination because of the treatment? Fearing a relapse, her mother decided to take her daughter to Valle de la Pascua, her hometown. She spent a few months with another psychiatrist there and made progress in her recovery. Thanks to Roxana's improvement, she decided to return to Caracas and resume her studies. Over time, as her sister later recounted, Roxana came to understand that what had been done to her was not an isolated case. That Dr. Chirino had done it to many others before, since she had seen things in that office and had put the pieces together. And from that moment on, she began to plan something that no one had dared to even try in 30 years, which was to use her own position to publicly denounce him, to expose him before the whole country. That was the plan, and it was a brave plan, even a reckless one. Roxana had returned to Caracas with a specific and very clear goal: to get hired by a TV channel and from that platform expose Dr. Chirinos. Roxana didn't want to be a victim resigned to silence. And to carry out that plan by a cruel irony, she needed to stay close to him, to keep having access. That's why she started visiting Dr. Chirinos' office again and got back in touch with this man. The only thing Roxana didn't anticipate well was how he would react when he realized what she was planning to do. A week before she died, Roxana achieved exactly what she was looking for because she had been formally hired by a television channel. For her, it was the first big step of this plan, the platform she needed. But for Chirinos, according to the family's later reconstruction, it was a warning sign that could not be ignored. And it must also be said, her dream was to be on television, to be famous, whatever you want to call it. But that dream turned into a clear goal, which was to expose what Chirinos was doing. And here you have to understand the logic of power, because that's what explains the motive. Up until that moment, in the relationship between the two, he had been the only one with access to the media, the only one with the ability to control the narrative. What the country thought and said, and that was his big advantage. It was his safe zone. But suddenly, an independent young woman, who knew his secrets first, and who had the declared intention of telling them, was about to get her own platform from which to speak. So this girl, whom he had considered manageable, even disposable, would suddenly become a real and concrete threat to his stability, his reputation, and all the status he had cared for his whole life. According to her sister, Roxana even sent chain emails to her acquaintances denouncing what Edmundo Chirinos was doing to his patients. And on one occasion, she wrote a letter to the doctor with a warning, telling him that if he kept doing the atrocities he was committing, she was going to report him and slip that letter under the door of his office. When he found out that she was trying to report him and reveal everything she knew, the psychiatrist called Roxana on the phone and said, "Do you know that I can have you killed?" That was the direct warning, and Roxana took it completely seriously, so seriously that she acted on it. Right after that threat, she did what we already mentioned. She told her mother absolutely everything and gave her the psychiatrist's phone numbers in case something happened to her. 7 days after that threat, Roxana disappeared. As soon as she went missing, her mother, true to what her daughter had warned her about, and without wasting a second in doubt, the first thing she did was call Dr. Chirinos and asked him if Roxana was with him, because they couldn't get in touch with her at that moment. He told her no, that he hadn't seen Roxana for months. Then her mother told him that she knew they used to see each other, but he told her that was a lie, that they hadn't seen each other in a long time. As I told you before, that's when Ana Maria went to the police and reported Edmundo Chirinos by name. 2 days later, the body was found in the vacant lot at Parque Caixa. The warning that Roxana had given her mother had come true to the letter, point by point, but having it come true was not the same as being able to prove it in court. Because the intuition of a victim, no matter how accurate it may be, cannot condemn anyone. And that's where the real battle began, which was to turn what the family knew into something that justice could not ignore. The Venezuelan forensic police began to follow the lead the family had been pointing to for days, while discarding them one by one. The initial hypotheses, like express kidnapping or a political motive, started to build a case against the psychiatrist that was much more solid than just the suspicions of some family members. They first checked phone communications from the day of the disappearance. The investigators found that in the hours before Roxana's trail was lost, there had been an exchange of calls between her and Chirinos. 6 calls, according to the case file. And it wasn't just important that those calls existed, it also mattered where the phone was located. The geolocation of those communications placed the young woman's cell phone in the area where the psychiatrist's office was located. In other words, the technical data confirmed exactly what Roxana had told her friends before she disappeared, that she was going to meet with him that afternoon. And they confirmed that indeed she had gone there. With that evidence, the investigators obtained a warrant to search the office located on Andres Bello Avenue in Caracas. And it was there, during that search, that the case stopped being just a family's suspicion and turned into something very different. They started by applying luminol, the reagent that forensic experts use to reveal traces of blood that are invisible to the naked eye. In Chirinos' office, the luminol reacted in several spots on the wall, on the carpet, and on the couch. The same couch where the psychiatrist saw his patients, where he supposedly did his therapy sessions. They collected the samples, took them for analysis, and the DNA almost instantly showed that the blood belonged to Roxana Vargas. On the couch, something else was found as well, a single earring. When the experts compared it to the one Roxana was still wearing when her body was found, the characteristics matched. So if it was the match to the one that was missing, the young woman had lost one of her earrings. Right there, in that office, in the place where her doctor swore up and down that she hadn't been there that night. The small object, which seemed like an insignificant detail, now connected him directly to the crime. Even so, the search was still to come, which finally revealed the true extent of what that man had done for decades. When the officials entered Chirinos' residence, they found a file that made it clear that Roxana had never been an isolated case. There were around 1,200 photographs and videos of women who were either naked or in their underwear. Many of them were patients of the psychiatrist and appeared sedated or asleep, photographed while they were unconscious on the couch in the office. Some with their clothes partially pulled up or down by the very person taking the pictures. And amid that whole horrifying archive, there was a photograph of Roxana completely naked. Some later investigations, like the work of a journalist named Roxana and Belis Pacheco, which ended up becoming a book called Blood on the Couch. They ended up talking about more than 1,500 women photographed over the years. More than 30 years of abuse, neatly archived in images by the perpetrator himself. The sleep cure, documented in photographs by the very person who used it as a cover. Investigators believe that Chirinos summoned Roxana to his office on the night of July 12th. At that moment, he brutally struck her on the head until he killed her, and then moved her body to the vacant lot, where she would be found days later. All of this was to prevent Roxana from telling everything he did to her, and to avoid public humiliation. With all that evidence against him, Edmundo Chirinos did something that ultimately ended up sinking him even more. He decided to defend himself in public, trusting that his prestige would work for him as always. On August 1, 2008, his arrest was ordered for the death of Roxana, initially under house arrest and with a ban on leaving the country. But before and during that process, Chirinos did what he knew best and what had always worked for him, which was to face the cameras. He was betting that his image as a respected authority would protect him as it had in the past, as it always had, but this time it backfired. He appeared on television smiling and making jokes about the case. He talked about the supposed love that both Roxana and other female patients had for him, and he ironically said that his male patients, on the other hand, didn't have the same affection for him, as if implying that the problem was that he was irresistible to women. Just imagine...
Because she's just one of the many young women who are murdered every weekend. The relationships with me, because she was my patient, and there have been many of my patients who have died, some of them murdered. So every time one of my patients dies, no matter how, the name Edmundo Chirinos has to appear in all the press.
And he repeated it over and over again every chance he got. That he was completely innocent, that all of this was a setup against him, and that the blood, the earring, and the photographs had been planted. That's what he said, that all the evidence had been planted. He was convinced that this appearance was going to save him. Luckily, it did exactly the opposite. Because when the country saw him there, smiling, arrogant, even mocking, defending himself with jokes about the murder of a 19-year-old girl, something shifted, luckily. Many women who had been through that office over the years and who had silently carried for decades what he had done to them. When they saw him, they realized they were no longer alone, that finally someone had put him against the ropes, although sadly that woman was no longer with me. And finally there was a crack in that armor of prestige, and they started to speak out. One after another, reports from former patients started to appear, all telling an identical story. The induced sleep, the later feeling that something had happened, waking up confused and feeling ashamed. Without being able to pinpoint why, the same public image that had protected him for 30 years changed in a matter of weeks. Everything collapsed, but why? We could say that this was like a weapon for him, one he knew how to handle, but everything turned against him. The legal process, of course, is neither quick nor simple. and there were moments when it seemed that the power of the accused was going to prevail over the evidence in the early stages of the process. In fact, the scales tipped in Chirinos' favor because in the initial stage they determined that the evidence was not conclusive enough. It's as if to support the accusation, and the weight of this man's name, as well as the age and influence of the accused, was felt at every moment of the hearing, in every decision. But Roxana's family, who had identified the person responsible from the very first day, and now they saw how that man kept defending himself, using all the power of his prestige and his connections. It was a period of pure anguish, with a real and reasonable fear that the case would fade away and that Chirinos could go free, like so many other powerful men before him. But the public prosecutor's office didn't drop the case, which, considering Venezuela at that time, was quite surprising. The public trial began on March 16, 2010 and lasted for 6 months of hearings. The prosecutors who brought the charges presented a large amount of evidence against Dr. Edmundo Chirinos before the court. The call records, the geolocation data showing Roxana on her way to the doctor's office, also the blood with her DNA found on the couch, the wall, also on the carpet, and the earring that matched the one missing from her body. The 1,200 photographs of the residence, the blog where the victim herself had written everything, and the testimony of 14 women. Many of them testified that Chirinos had abused them while they were sedated during their appointments. In September 2010, Edmundo Chirinos was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the intentional homicide of Roxana Vargas. The court also disqualified him from practicing psychiatry for the entire duration of his sentence, forever shutting the door to the office he had used as his hunting ground until his last days. Chirinos insisted that he was innocent and that all the evidence against him had been planted, and he never admitted to anything, which is ridiculous. It must be said, it's ridiculous because the evidence was clear and so were the witnesses. So I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist. It's ironic for me to say that because he was a psychiatrist, but I'm not. I can't say that he was a psychopath, but it seems, at least from my point of view, he seems like a psychopath. He seems like a narcissist. I hope real psychologists can say in the comments what his profile would be. I think that it's always said that it's wrong to mention the disorders or problems that a person might have. But we're talking about a criminal. And one of the worst too, so I don't think anyone would be offended. The sentence didn't give anything back to Roxana's family, and this outcome, for those who followed the case, left a bittersweet feeling. While in prison, Chirinos suffered a stroke that left him with significant after effects. We're discussing speech problems, and also his need to use a wheelchair, which he used, along with his decline and his age, to support his case. Because he argued that the Venezuelan penal code did not allow a man over 70 years old to be kept behind bars. He even went so far as to send a letter to President Hugo Chavez, his former patient, asking him for a pardon. He said he was being held in a cell unsuitable for someone of his age and condition, and he asked for the law to be upheld. In his case, fortunately, the pardon never came, although something did come. A milder measure because in March 2012 he was granted house arrest, taking into account his advanced age and health condition. Ironically, when Chirino left prison on his way home, he walked out on his own. Not in the wheelchair he claimed to be confined to, not like the invalid old man he had presented himself as in court to soften his situation. The following year, specifically on August 24, 2013, Edmundo Chirinos was found dead in his residence in Caracas, where he was under house arrest. He was 78 years old. He died at home of natural causes. For many, that was the most bitter ending to the case. The man, who had destroyed dozens of lives, spent just a handful of years paying for it, and did so in the comfort of his home in the end. The Vargas family, meanwhile, was marked forever by what happened. Roxana's father died of depression in 2009, just a year after the crime, without even living to see the conviction of the person responsible. The mother, Anna Teresa carried on the legal battle until the end with a strength that impressed everyone around her. She was never afraid of the accused. She faced him in court and told him that he was responsible for her daughter's death. After the conviction, she did her best to rebuild her life. She died in 2016 of a massive heart attack, having accomplished what she set out to do, making sure her daughter's killer did not go unpunished for more than 30 years. Dozens, maybe more than 1,500 women sat on the couch in that office on Andres Bello Avenue and left in silence. Defeated in advance by the prestige of the man who treated them, they had no way to prove anything nor anyone to turn to. Who would believe them over the president's psychiatrist? Because Chirinos' power not only allowed him to abuse, but also somehow guaranteed that no one would believe his victims. And that was his real shield. Roxana Vargas didn't have any more power than any of those women. She didn't have contacts or influence or a last name that carried weight. But she had the determination to seek justice for what had happened to her, to what she had written in her blog and in her diary. She had told her mother everything that had happened between her and her psychiatrist and warned her that he had already threatened her. And unfortunately, her death helped uncover the abuses that Chirinos committed against his defenseless patients during his supposed sleep cures. Today, the office on Andres Bello Avenue, where all this happened, is abandoned, and the owners realized that the person who practiced there left immediately. The facilities of the couch, from the photographs and from the 30 years of horror, all that's left is an empty place and the memory of a country that for too long preferred not to knock on the door to ask what was happening on the other side. That's all for today's case. Formed materials from down here, and in this way, we will meet again next time.